the haunting of her heart. Mara had always known that love could be dangerous, but she never expected it would haunt her so literally. It all started with Eli. They'd met at a small cafe on a rainy afternoon. She'd been sipping her coffee by the window, watching the raindrops race down the glass, when he slid into the seat across from her. Handsome with a gentle smile, Eli was magnetic in a way that felt like fate. They spent hours talking, laughing, sharing stories as if they'd known each other for lifetimes. From that day, they were inseparable. Eli was attentive, showering Mara with affection, almost too much so. He called constantly, surprised her at work, and often stayed over, making sure she never felt alone. But Mara found comfort in his intensity, until she began to feel its weight. One night, after a particularly intense argument, Eli stormed out, his face twisted with pain and fury. He muttered, "If you can't love me, I'd rather be dead," and vanished into the rain. Mara spent hours calling and searching for him, her heart heavy with worry and guilt. But the next morning, the call came. Eli had been in an accident, a fatal one. She dropped to the floor, unable to breathe, shattered by the news that he was truly gone. The days that followed were a blur of grief, a bottomless ache she couldn't escape. She'd lie awake at night, haunted by memories of him. She could still smell his cologne on her clothes, feel the weight of his gaze in the shadows of her apartment. Her world felt unbearably empty. But soon, strange things began happening. It started with her phone. Late at night, she'd get texts from an unknown number. The messages were cryptic. Single words like miss, always, together, words Eli had used in life. She tried to dismiss it as a sick prank, perhaps someone who'd heard of his death. But deep down, she felt something far darker lingering. One night, her phone rang, the familiar chime Eli had set for himself. Her heart raced as she picked up, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" Only silence answered. She hung up, shaken, but then it rang again. "Eli, is that you?" she whispered, feeling foolish. A faint voice, barely audible, echoed through the static. "Forever." The call disconnected, leaving Mara paralyzed, the air around her thick with dread. That night, she lay awake, her heart pounding, convinced she felt someone watching her. Days later, she awoke to find a single red rose on her pillow, Eli's signature gesture. Her heart froze. She hadn't been near roses in weeks, and no one else had the key to her apartment. The rose was fresh, vibrant, its petals eerily reminiscent of the ones Eli had given her. Mara began feeling his presence everywhere, his scent lingering in the air, cold spots in her bedroom. And once, a ghostly figure she could have sworn was him, standing by her window, watching her with an unreadable gaze. Desperate, she turned to Eli's best friend, Paul, who had always been skeptical of the supernatural. She poured out her fears, hoping he'd dismiss them as irrational. But instead, Paul grew pale. "Mara, did Eli ever mention his grandfather?" Paul asked, his voice tense. Mara shook her head, confused. His grandfather. He was obsessed with life after death. Tried all sorts of rituals to bring back loved ones, saying love was a bond even death couldn't sever. Eli used to say he'd go to any lengths to stay with the one he loved, even if he had to come back. Mara's blood ran cold. Had Eli done something to ensure he would never leave her, even in death? She decided to confront her fears, returning home that night determined to make peace with whatever presence was haunting her. She spoke aloud, her voice trembling. "Eli, if you're here, I need you to let go. You're scaring me." But the shadows seemed to deepen, and the room grew colder. In that moment, her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, her face pale with fear. But standing behind her, clear as day, was Eli, his expression one of anger and longing. "You promised to be with me, always," he whispered, his voice a mere breath against her ear. Paralyzed, she watched as his cold hand reached up, brushing her hair away from her neck. Her heart pounded, terror mingling with an almost hypnotic familiarity. His touch was cold, but there was a longing in his eyes, a love so intense it had defied death itself. In a trembling voice, she said, "Eli, please, I can't live like this. You have to let me go." But his ghostly face twisted with rage. "You are mine, Mara. You will always be mine." That night, her phone buzzed with one final message from the unknown number. "See you soon." The next morning, Mara's friends found her, eyes wide open, frozen in terror, her phone lying beside her. The screen showed the same message she'd received from Eli, endlessly repeating, "Together, forever." They buried Mara beside Eli, a rose placed between them. But visitors claim that if you listen closely at night, you can hear faint whispers echoing from their graves. Together, forever. And sometimes, on the darkest of nights, a figure appears at the edge of the cemetery, watching with unblinking eyes, waiting to claim anyone who dares come between him and his beloved.